Okay, so good evening, everyone. I don't want to delay, so I'm going to start. I'm not too sure if your peers will still join in, and if they don't, we have the recording where they can tap into the needed session or get the information that will be discussed. I want to thank each of you for your time, for joining in, and we're going to cover or at least touch on sampling this evening. Please, if there's any interaction or chat or question that you have, please raise the question. As I've said, when I share my screen, I can't see the chat box at this particular time. Okay, so just for clarity, a few of you emailed me, you've missed the session last week, and I did share the slides and put up announcements on what was covered in the first session for this semester. But just to reiterate, the main way that I will be accessible is through email and on work days, weekdays. And on a Tuesday, I will access my emails quite late, but I do try and respond to you as frequently as I can, and you will use your email to access. I am not on any WhatsApp groups. I don't think that we will or I will be accessible on WhatsApp. This will be the primary way to reach me, alternatively during the lectures or these online sessions. I did share that I load content onto the YouTube channel, and I would like to invite you to access these sessions, especially when we have our live sessions and we might not complete content fully, or I might still have something I wanted to articulate, or we run out of time, or just because you've missed the session, you will find all the videos or recordings that I upload for you on this channel. And I will also load additional information here. So whenever you've got time or you just need to play it in the background as a podcast, or you're busy cooking and you've got this video playing, just to keep your mind focused on content and the theory that is behind it, or just for some context if you've missed the session. I also then introduced a photo circle app last week. This app is going to be utilized as soon as all of us are on it. It is a tool that we can use almost as an internal social media platform, if you want to look at it that way. It's where we will share all our insights on our particular research studies. So let's say you've got a study where you're going to make progress, and next year when you start collecting your data, the journey that you take and every step that you are on, you're going to share your insights and your journey on this particular app with us. It seems a bit weird at first because it's new and not many of us are familiar with each other outside of the WhatsApp group that we are on. But I would advise and humbly ask that all of you please scan the QR code, connect, because it's important that we form those professional relationships outside of just that WhatsApp space, and also in a unique way that possibly could become a tool that you utilize in your lectures moving forward, in your classrooms moving forward, in your tutor groups, or wherever you're going to be in a teaching and learning space. And then just for clarity, the way I run the online sessions might be a bit weird for some of you, or it might be welcomed by some of you. But I do integrate technology, and I just wanted to pause for a session or for a moment and inform you that these are the number of applications that I'm going to integrate as the 14 weeks progress. And I will try not over utilize them to an extent where you are exhausted. But I do want to just put a disclaimer that I utilize technology because of the interaction in an online space. For those of you who are lecturers and who have lectured in the online space, or you've worked online, or just attending a meeting online, there's a disconnect that often happens. And for us to overcome that, I utilize technology. And I utilize it in a way that I think is fun and that I also think is applicable and appropriate for the age group, for the students, for the level where we are at. So the ones that I've chosen for this particular module is ones based on what you could utilize moving forward, and that should be at a level that you can interact with without feeling that it's a bit too much. But if it becomes too much, you're more than welcome to pop me an email and say, Dai, please tone it down a bit. But ideally, the first application was Photo Circle that I've explained in a bit. Canva is where I share all my slides and my interactive teaching and learning material on. YouTube is, as I've explained, where all the recordings will go. Mentimeter is just an online chat tool that I utilize, and it allows me to put up polls and word clouds from your interactions. And you'll see later today I conclude with one on Mentimeter. Mendeley is a reference manager tool that is not a requirement in the module, but I do think it's important for me to introduce and showcase it to you and utilize it in an activity, so that for those of you who are still referencing the old school way, or the you put everything manually, there are easier ways to put your proposal together to ensure that all your references are there and they're kept in a safe space, and they kept in a place where you can always access them, even if you change devices or lose a device or your laptop doesn't work. Then all the articles and tools or sources that you utilize is stored in one place. So that particular tool, you don't have to utilize it if it's not something that interests you. If you are used to doing something a certain way and it works for you, you're more than welcome to do so. But I am introducing it so that you understand or can utilize technology in that way should you need to. Kahoot is just a tool I utilize at the end for quiz, and I'll do it later on. SurveyMonkey is a tool that I utilize to collect my data. I just want to introduce it so that you see what kind of tools you can use once you go into the field and next year start collecting your data, or later this year. LinkedIn is a professional platform where I also think we should start collaborating. As I mentioned in the first session, I might invite you to be a speaker at one of my conferences or on my campus, or be a guest lecturer because you've got a topic that is close to or focused on the theme that we're covering. And so for us to have those shared spaces, the LinkedIn platform will be where we, at the end, conclude our lesson as I've planned it. And then the Blackboard tab is the one where all our sessions are on, but I'm just going to use Blackboard a bit differently from what you're used to later on as well. So I'm just giving you a heads up that for my sessions, I would ask that you would have your cell phone as well as your laptop accessible. I do understand some of you are still traveling home, you're still on the road, or you have just one device, or your battery might be flat, or whatever the case might be. But I'm giving you a heads up not only because I integrate it, but many of you will be transferring into teaching and learning, and you will be utilizing one of these tools at some point. It is a requirement for the 21st century that we are teaching in, for the students we are engaging with, and it's important that we move with the times as well. One more announcement just from my side. I've planned out, and I'm going to email this to each of you at the end of the session, because I just want to make touch base on email with each of you. But just to give you a sense of how I work, so each learning objective is covered each week. So where you've seen I put the numbers, it's how I plan to progress over the weeks with Learning Unit 3 and ultimately complete with Learning Unit 4. I do leave room in between for where you can put up your hand and say, Dai, can you go back and cover Learning Unit 2 that was covered by the previous lecture? I'm not sure of this particular content. So there will be room in between where you can ask me to repeat something that you're still not clear of. Or you could also ask me to put up a recording on that particular topic, and I could put it on YouTube for you as well. So just for clarity, you'll see in the email that I'm going to send to you, it looks like this. It's a semester planner. All that I did was consolidate the timetable and your module outline to split it according to weeks. So if you should miss a session, or you should not be with me, or you're logged in but you're busy with 12 other things, you can always go back to the planner and make sure you connect with where I am, because I won't be able to go back and repeat something. And I also don't want you to be lost or email me something that I've already covered. So the planner will guide you and say, for the 9th of July, there was an introduction session with an ICE Task 3. For the 16th of July, we're now covering Theme 1, sampling the Learning Objective 1. So it gives you some kind of context or direction. I hope that this will help you. For many of the feedback that I've seen from the previous semester, that there was perhaps a disconnect in terms of what's actually happening in which lecture. So I just wanted to give you some context to help you plan and to help you organize yourselves. I'm a bit pedantic in that way. For August, as you can see, I have sent you already, or in our previous session, I made an announcement and put on my slides that ICE Task 3 will be due on the 13th of August. So I just wanted to pause this evening and say the date will stay the same. The 13th of August is when it is due. However, I am aware that in my planning, the 20th is when I will cover ethical considerations only. So what I've done is I've put a sheet for you on ethical consideration sheet checklist. I've loaded it for you on Learn already, and it's consolidating the main points that you need for the ICE task to complete it, so that I don't send you in the dark or I don't leave you lost for that particular ICE task. If you look at the checklist I've given you and you listen to the recording or reflect on what we talked about last week, you should be able to complete that ICE task. If you at any point feel lost or don't understand what ethical considerations are or need me to reiterate it, anytime between now and the 13th of August, you're more than welcome to pop me an email or send me communication in the live sessions like these and say, Dai, can you please repeat or clarify something regarding ISASC 3? But for the most part, I've tried to simplify it. The Word document is loaded on the platform. And if you are unable to navigate or find it, just pop me an email. I'll send it to you as well. So last week, I discussed ISASC 3. I'm giving you a QR code that will take you to the link as well in this particular slides. And there's an example of the ethical consideration checklist that I've put for you. And you can tick which ones are going to be applicable for your particular study. So it covers informed consent, collecting your data from your participants, dealing with sensitive information, providing incentives, avoiding harm, dealing with confidentiality, and then avoiding deception in your particular study. Read through the document, and if anything is unclear or you want me to explicitly unpack it before the ICE task, you're more than welcome to touch base, but I think I've consolidated it to be self-explanatory. But I'm more than happy to repeat it or clarify it if you need me to do so. So please have a look and shout throughout the week, and I could start clarifying that next week if there's anyone who needs me to do so. I think this is my final announcement before we dive into what we needed to do. You'll see on the discussion thread, ICE Task 3 is loaded there with the instructions, and one participant or student in the class have already attempted it and uploaded their work, so I know it is accessible from your side. So please, if you could click on discussions between now and the 13th of August and comfortably do this particular ICE task. I've copied and pasted the instructions as it is from the guide for the instructions of that particular ICE task, so nothing is different from what you already have, but it's just purely copied there so that you can see it's exactly the same thing or to give you some guidance and context there. What I will do is I'll pull this into the ICE task tab where the grade center is for me to capture your marks at a later stage once the deadline has been reached for this particular task. Before I go on, let me go back to the chat and just see regarding ICE task 3, are you all okay? And if I need to answer any questions. This is helpful. It definitely makes the planning around. Thank you so much. I see a hand. Karen, you may speak.
Hi, Di. I just wanted to ask about the ICE task marking. For our other subjects, we either get full marks or 0. Is that the same way that you work?
The same way. The same way.
Thank you.
I will still add feedback and give you context as to what the mark is, just to give you guidance as to what you could have done to improve, or I'll put up a standard memo if everybody more or less got the ICE task correct and just give some guidance. But generally we capture with 0 or the full mark, yes. Okay, so in essence, I think we're all still good. So I'm going to go back to sharing again. And please feel free to unmute if you need me to pause for a second or just clarify again. So for the participants or students who were not present last week, I will email each of you this evening for an introduction from myself and to share that planner that I have with you. Just for clarity, again, on the Learn platform, there's so much content from the first semester. I got a bit lost, and so then I decided to put a new row of just content for second semester, and I will emphasize or make the headings red so that you know those are all my ones for second semester. So if you do go onto the Learn platform and you click on the Learn lecture slides, you should be able to scroll down and see all the updated semester 2 content. I'm not going to remove anything from semester 1 for in case you might still need it. So I'm just going to upload and create new folders for my particular work. So please take note, my signature or my name will always be the end of to help you keep track of it. And on a weekly basis, you will see an announcement with the PDF version of my slides, with a link for the YouTube video, and for guidance of the next lecture. Or the next live session. So you'll find it on the Learn platform if you just navigate a bit, and please look for all the red headings. That's where you'll find me. Okay, so then we get to this evening. Just for context, we're busy with sampling. And sampling, just in your overall layout of your proposal that you're working towards, your headings for it will more or less look like what I've tried to put together here. So you'll have an abstract that is a summary of your entire study. You'll have an introduction, you'll have a problem statement, you'll have objectives, and then you'll have your methodology section. So the sampling that we are going to discuss will each feed into your methodology section. And the sampling at the end of it, if you have defined your population well and you've narrowed down your sampling, it's going to make it easier for you to get together your data in the end if you have done this particular part correctly. So for the sake of us starting off the session, I wanted to ask you to please scan the QR code for me and just give me some idea whether you've got a qualitative or a quantitative study. I think let me just share it better from the Mentimeter application, which will make it easier. Yeah, I think this will be a bit more visible. So if you can scan the QR code and just indicate for me, do you have a qualitative study or a quantitative study? And by 50-50, I just mean, do you have a mixed method? Are you using both or have a different method that you've selected? Okay. So from the results on the poll on the screen, majority of us are qualitative, and some have chosen quantitative studies, and some of us would use a blend of both. And our worlds would probably collide, and we'll have both of select both quantitative and qualitative sampling methods and draw from both aspects. If you are still not clear, or perhaps at a point where you are still going to correct or change or make changes or fix it, that also gives us a sense of where you are, and we could always come back and discuss it again and clarify and align with what you've chosen as your particular method, and your supervisor will also guide you on that one. So thank you for your responses. I'll come back to this particular chat and I'll send an announcement at the end also for us to be reminded of what we've chosen and what are we working towards. Okay, so for this evening, sampling is focused on, or we're going to home in on learning objective 1, and it asks that you construct a description of the sample of the study, which clearly communicates the nature and the size of the sample and the sampling methods to be utilized. So the end of this session, and if we don't cover it, I'll pick up in the next session again, and I'll load a recording that unpacks it once more. But ideally, at the end of this session, you should have an idea who exactly your sample is for your study. You should be able to communicate what the nature and the size of that particular sample more or less will be, and your supervisor will guide you more or less of the size if you're not 100% clear on that. And then the sampling methods that you utilize to get to that particular sample is what you need to more or less have an idea of. This is an important session, so I am going to cover it this evening. And before I start off next week, I'll touch base with a few Q&A and I'll unpack and clarify again. So for this particular session, sampling is the process of selecting a sub of participants from a larger group. So all of us, when we think of our study, we've got this larger population that we think of, and then we need to narrow down our study to look at a particular sample, which are the participants that will engage in your particular study. So for your vocabulary and for us who's new to research, population and sample become two new words that you need to start thinking around. And as mentioned, the population is the larger group, and the subset is the group that you will engage with to collect your data from or to engage or interact for your study. And that subset or that smaller group is called a sample. For me, when I started with research, the way I could understand or make it clear for myself is thinking of a cake. And the cake in itself is the population. And if I take a slice from that, it's a smaller portion of what I will be engaging with or interacting with. And in that particular slice should be all the ingredients, should be, if I bite or eat this particular slice, it should give me more or less an idea what the entire cake would taste like. So that's more or less what a sample in a population means. But in our studies, there are different types of sampling depending on qualitative or quantitative that we've chosen. So some of you, as indicated on the poll, you've got a quantitative study, and some of you, as indicated, have a qualitative study or a mixed method, depending on what your approach, your research aims, or your research questions are that you want to answer at the end of your particular study. To make sense of it in sampling, two new words are added again to our vocabulary, which speaks of probability and non-probability sampling. Probability, with the picture that I've depicted there to help you, means that it leans towards a quantitative sample, and non-probability leans towards a qualitative study. Although some people also use non-probability in quantitative studies as well, in order to make sense or be able to link to that mixed method when you've chosen to incorporate it. So for probability, it uses random methods, and it is a representative sample that is unbiased. But for qualitative, it leans towards a bias because the researcher is in charge of or has access to be able to manipulate and twist it and almost change it to the way you want to. There are ways to stay away from bias and avoid it, and that's where those ethical considerations will come in. But ideally, people are hesitant to use qualitative because of that ability that you can that there's an influence in the data if the researcher allows it. But the sampling method you use affects how confidently you can generalize your results to the population as a whole. So that cake in itself, if you've got a sample, that one slice that you take out, it will allow you to be able to generalize what you find in that one slice for the entire cake. Hoping that makes sense. So probability, just for clarity, you are using statistics, numbers, and you select your participants or any other unit of interest. It could have been animals, artifacts, and you will use it on a statistically random basis. But for non-probability, which is the qualitative one, the participant selection is not made on a statistically random basis, but it's made on the judgment and discretion of the researcher. And it's done with the intention to find depth and richness from the data collected or the interaction or the interviews or the discussions or your questionnaire that you will utilize to collect that particular data. So this evening, I'm going to introduce the probability samples first. I'll then pause, go back to the chat, and we'll look at the time and the interactions that you have or the questions that you have. For this one, I just want to check if you have the textbook on your side. Just want to come to the chat to see. Are you using the chat the textbook, the prescribed material, research methods. I think it's edition 2. Okay, I just want to answer a question as well while you respond. Could you kindly confirm whether the following elements will form part of the research methodology for assessment? Is it the research design, the participants, sampling methods, data collection methods, procedures, materials, and measures and data analysis? Or is this being covered this evening? Okay, so the ones you've listed will still be covered. The primary topic for this evening is only sampling methods. So it's the first part of what you're asking. Data collection methods, the procedures, the materials or data collection tools that you will use, and the analysis and the findings and all the other elements follow later. This evening, it's primarily just speaking of the sampling method portion. Anel, I hope that answers your question. So the details of the
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, cool. Okay, so primarily I'm asking regarding the textbook. I know there's a soft copy that you can access in the online platform, or you could have physically purchased the hard copy. My slides are not wordy, so I don't put too many words, or I use the words for at the end when I want to do a quiz. Generally, I put images and we discuss what your understanding is of a particular session. So I'm asking if you've got the textbook. I'm glad that you do. And if you don't have it, perhaps you'll make notes on your side and perhaps access it or utilize it, especially for portions or aspects that we covered this evening, to simplify for yourself more or less what I am talking about. I did send an announcement asking that you do read through the chapter prior so that you can keep up or keep track or ask questions or engage fully in the session. If you did not manage to do so, perhaps in the next session, please do have access to this textbook, because the next few topics that are coming up, as Anel has noted, are going to be driven or embedded in this particular textbook. And you will use the textbook as a source in your write-up for your proposal as well. Okay, so we're going to start with the probability sampling methods first, and then I'll pause and come back to the chat and ask your inputs or clarity. So the probability sampling methods are for all those who have selected quantitative studies. The probability sampling methods, you need to at least select one of those to help guide your study. For the rest of you, if you've got a portion of your study that's mixed, that will lean towards quantitative, then this is also the next 4 slides will be particularly for you to engage with and to think about which of these are relevant for you. So I'm going to introduce them and then come back to the chat and see if we can discuss, and you can tell me if you've got clarity or a bit confused, and we can clarify them. And just a disclaimer, I am more versed in qualitative than I am in quantitative, but I'm going to do my best to guide you through as I had to study them as well. Okay. I think this is where I am. Okay. So first up, for probability, which is also called random sampling, we're going to start with simple random sampling, which is the first one. Now, simple random sampling, this is where we try to choose or make sure that every member of a population has an equal chance of being selected. There are a few different ways that you can use, but this is probably the most simplistic option that anyone who starts out with quantitative studies will select. And here it's like, consider it as just choosing a number from a hat. So if you had 40 people in your lecture room or in your classroom, you would give each one a number and randomly select from a hat. You could also use a calculator or computer systems. At the moment, there's so many apps that you can have random number generators from. And this is probably simplistically the easiest, cheapest, and most efficient way of utilizing it, depending that sample dependent, obviously. So if you've got a sample small enough for you to number, and put name charts or anonymous pseudonyms for them if you're not going to use their real names, and just select from a hat who you want to utilize for your study. So that's simple random sampling basically put. And here you can generalize fairly reliably your sample. So if you handpick 10 out of the 40, you will do so with simple random sampling selection. I hope that is as simplistic as I can put it. What you need to be aware of for this particular one is that it can hide the impact of the large subgroups that are embedded within the results that you find. So within that 40 students, if you're only randomly picking 10, you could have missed out on minority subgroups that are embedded in it. So depending on what your research questions are and your aims are, be careful when you are going to select, consider what your aim for your study was and what your research questions were to guide you. The second probability sample option is systematic sampling. And this is where the researcher will assign a counting number to every population member and then select a random number of the selected members at regular intervals. So let's say, for example, I've got 1,000 students in this online session, and I just want to select from the 1,000 50 students. I will choose a random number. Let's say I check 234. And I'll consider firstly that I've got 1,000 students. I only want 50. I'm going to divide 50 by 1,000 and find the interval of 20. I hope my maths is making sense. So initially I thought of a number 234. I'm going to add 20 each time to 234 to get to the 50 participants that I wanted. So if I start with 234, I'm going to add 20. It will land on number 254. I'll choose that participant. I'll add another 20. So initially what quantitative studies does is you number each participant. And then depending on the approach that you're taking, for a systematic one, there's an interval that you will choose a number depending on the quantity, the amount of participants, what exactly your study is looking for to give you clarity. Okay, so that's number 2. Number 3 is your stratified sample. For this particular one, this is where the researcher will divide a population into subgroups to have members from each segment of the population and a random sample derived from each subgroup. So for example, you select your participants randomly, but with a certain predefined strata is what we call it, subgroup, that have a common trait. So here you specifically look for something specific. So let's say you want to stratify a given population based on gender or based on a level of education, and then you're going to select participants from that particular group for your sample. I hope this makes sense. We'll look at the textbook in a bit to clarify. Then the final one for probability is cluster sampling. This is probably one of my favorites if I had to use quantitative study. You're going to divide the sample into clusters, which is just little sections, and then randomly select one or more of the clusters and use all of the members in that particular cluster for your sample. This is like grouping them and choosing the groups that you want. This is used when the population is large geographically, or if you wanted to look at a number of schools in a province, or you wanted to look at a number of cities within a country. This allows you to cluster them and then to choose only those selected clusters from that particular group. So those are the 4 probability samples methods that you could choose from. I am going to create slides with wording if you needed them, but if you followed in your particular guide and our textbook and you prepared more or less for the session, these 4 would not be so foreign, but if it is, just shout on the chat and I can give you a bit more detailed slides should you need them. But ideally for all of us who are leaning towards quantitative study, we've got simple random sampling where you just choose them by numbering them. we've got, and you choose them out of a hat, so that would be the simplistic one. We then have on page 155 systematic sampling, and this is where you have to work out where an interval will happen for you to add a number. So if I've chosen a random number of 50, and every time I get to a certain number of 10, I will then choose number 60, who's number 70, who's number 80. So there's an interval that guides you on how to select your participant. On page 156, there's stratified sampling. And for stratified sampling is where you will divide the population into subgroups. And then finally, cluster sampling. This is where it involves that you divide the sample into groups or clusters, and you, based on what exactly you want or how far, let's say what exactly your group is used for. Let's say it's used for a specific, it's too large, so you narrow them in chunks or groups or clusters, and you choose based on, let's say if you've got 8 clusters, you just want 4 to narrow your study down a bit. There's a question. My topic is on the right to access higher education, a case of KZN. Would this fall under cluster sampling? I think your first question would be, or my first question to you would be, is your study qualitative or quantitative? If it is quantitative, then you need to choose right to access higher education, a case of KZN. If you are looking at higher education institutions, I presume from the higher education mentioned in your statement, then you would look at the, are you looking at, or I'm assuming, the number of higher education institutions in KZN? Then you have to narrow it down, but that would be your larger cluster. And then you have to look at it and give it characteristics that you can narrow your sample a bit in order to get to what it is you want to find. So your research questions will give you an idea which clusters you can select. But you are correct, you can choose cluster sampling depending on what exactly your research questions are. So if you could email me, and I could advise a bit more once I get a sense of what exactly your study is aiming for, or what your research aim is, or your research questions are. For the other two who have also noted that they've used quantitative studies, from the 4 that we spoke of, is there one that you gravitate towards that could be something that you've chosen or not? And you guys don't even tell me that the time is up. Okay. For the quantitative studies students, is there any one who has more or less an idea, or is it confusing still at this point? For the other students who are still on the call, qualitative will pick up from next week, and I will also share a bit more. Time did go a bit too fast. I didn't realize that. My apology. I do want to have integrity with time and stop on time. Just for clarity regarding the voting with the times last week, I know that we discussed in the group that the possibility of moving the timeline for earlier would be considered. I did receive a, oh, you're right, Nozipo, 8:30. I did consider changing the timeline, but received a few emails of participants that prefer the time that you have allocated or that is scheduled for. So perhaps the group can have a consensus or a discussion around what would work best, and then just give me the guideline as to which way I should move. I don't want to inconvenience anyone, so I'm going to stay with the allocated time that was originally scheduled, unless you all as a collective agree that we can move. So I would ask that in your WhatsApp groups that you please continue your discussions on your side regarding our time. Thanks, Nazipo, for notifying me. I still have a few minutes left. I was thinking that we stop at 8 for some reason. Okay, so quantitative studies, probability sampling techniques that were mentioned are yours to choose from. You need to read through the research or your textbook again and choose one, the most simplistic one that you can utilize to clarify your study. My advice would be don't overthink or complicate the study. Keep your choices as simplistic and as small. Keep your samples as narrow as you possibly can. Try not to think of the entire province of the entire. It becomes too large for this particular level that your studies are on, unless you're guided differently by your supervisor. So, Nduvuo, your question was, my topic is on the right to access higher education, a case of KZN. My advice would be narrow it, choose a particular institution, choose one. If you're going to cluster, it means you're looking at more than one university or more than one, then it becomes a bit complex. But you will email me and you and I will discuss that offline. I hope that helps or gives context. I'm going to dive into the qualitative options just to help the rest who have also. And could we perhaps email you our decision? Yes. So what I'm going to do is this evening, I'm emailing each of you who were present in this recording, my planner, and I'm going to ask you to please give me context of your study and ask you which sampling method did you or are you envisioning or thinking about, for us to start a dialogue for me to help you. But my advice is merely advice. Your supervisor works a bit more closely with you and would be able to give you the direction for the study as a whole. Okay, I hope that helps. But you're more than welcome to touch base to ask me questions as well. Okay, so let me get into the qualitative options for the majority of the participants who are using qualitative, and then we can resume. Okay. Please note that for these sessions, it would be advisable to pre-read or so that you can follow alongside me, because it might feel a bit quick or a bit much or a bit explanations that you will get lost in. Okay, so non-probability sampling on the other hand is the qualitative one, and I'm a bit biased. I lean towards qualitative, so I'm going to try and stay neutral. The first one is accidental, which just simplistically by the name in itself tells you what it means. Here, participants who were at the right place at the right time basically are what you're going to consider. So let's say you are in a passage at the institution you work at, and everybody who passes that particular passage at a particular time will answer the questions that you have for them. And if they're willing to participate, this could even be at a mall. You could stand at an entrance and collect information from people who are willing to participate. So accidental means it's those participants who are there at the right time, willing to ask you, willing to answer the questions that you will ask them. The results obtained here cannot be considered to be generalizable, so you can't generalize that what they're going to respond is what everybody would have said, because it could be influenced by the time that you're standing at that particular passage. The mall that you've chosen could be a demographic where only certain people go to that particular mall. So your answers or responses that you get could be biased in a sense, or could not be generally what everybody would have responded if you had a more generalizable option that is more linked to quantitative study. So take note, all the options that we are going to discuss now based on this non-probability, they are considered to be options that we need to be cautious for bias, and we need to be cautious that it's not something that generally, that is a generalizable sample all the time. And the reason for that is taking us back to my initial introduction. Here we are thinking about depth and the richness of the content, the conversations or the data you're going to collect, not necessarily the other way around as with quantitative. The next one is convenient sampling, and what I love about the non-probability options, the names say exactly what you need to understand from them. So convenient sampling, here the participants are available and accessible for you as the researcher. So it's what's convenient for you. Generally, when I started my research, this is what I opted for because I could plan it around my availability, my budget, my time frame, and it was convenient for me, as opposed to using a predefined process that is readily available as in quantitative study. So here you are unlikely to produce a representative sample that is generalizable, And also you are vulnerable to research bias here because you've chosen, it's almost like you've handpicked them. There are ways to work around it and to justify and show your non-bias, and that will be discussed under the ethical considerations. So don't worry too much about now being doubtful of which option you should choose because they're all saying they could be biased. There are ways that you are going to justify and support and back up or substantiate why you've chosen this particular sampling method. The next one that follows for number 3 is quota sampling. When I started, this was probably the most confusing one. So quota sampling, it's similar to purpose of sampling because the researcher can purposefully choose who you want, but as a different way of collecting that particular sample here. This method is where you take a very tailored sample and you use the proportion of what you find by considering the characteristics or the traits of a population. So for example, you're going to select the participants based on the number or the averages that you find just as you find them. So let's say you have 30% females in the classroom and 70% males in the classroom. And from this sample, you only want 10. Your sample will need to have 3 females, which was the least number, and 7 males, which was the most number. There's no balancing it out and trying to find 5 females and 5 males. The quota asks you to think about exactly the reality of what you find to narrow the sample with what you find. I hope that makes sense and we can unpack it a bit more in a bit. The snowballing one is one of my favorites. This is when you are choosing a sample that is a referral from someone else. So let's say you've got a topic that is very sensitive. People won't put up their hand to volunteer for your particular study. So what you will do is once you found someone that participates, they will be your smaller snowball, for example, and they will go out, find someone else, and that person will be a referral and the snowball will become bigger. So basically, people will come to your research study here based on who they trust and refer them to you. So if you've got one of those niche studies that are complicated, you can't just find people to volunteer or easily accessible, or you can't just stand in the mall and with a chart and people will come to you. This is those peculiar ones that are unique, probably contested or sensitive topics, and the sample is unlikely to interact with you unless they are referred by someone else. Volunteering sample, just as was said in the name, this is where participants will volunteer to be part of your study. Generally, students will volunteer if they think there's something in it for them, from my experience. But here there's a willingness from the participant to be part of your study. There is, however, bias with this one because it depends on what you are asking. The people who want to be part of your study will come. People who are a bit shy or a bit negatively impacted by the title of your topic won't come. So it will not be a fair example of a sample that gives you the depth that you're looking for. For example, if I wanted to do the success pass rate in my faculty, only the students who do well will volunteer. Only those who've passed, only those who've excelled will come. The students who haven't done so well wouldn't want to be seen or participate because they are not going to think that they had success, so why should they be part of the study, for example. Purpose of sample, also a very popular one. This is where you as the researcher will use your judgment. You will use your, you are able to select the participants using your own judgment based on the purpose of your particular study. So you are driven by your study's aims here. You are driven by what is the research questions you want to answer. So you will use your judgment to engage with the specific participants and that you choose or that you target. This is specifically for some of us who have a specific niche or a person that you want who's got experience with a particular tool or experience or knowledge on a specific topic that you want the information from. It's unlikely to produce a generalizable result, but it narrows the study and again allows you to get the depth that you're looking for. My current study, I'm looking at how students are utilizing generative AI in their first year, And I'm looking particularly for students who are in their first year in education, utilizing generative AI. So I'm purposefully looking for a particular sample. I am saying, this is the dots I want to connect. These are the particular samples that I want. And when I'm doing that, I'm purposefully choosing as the researcher who I want. Again, there's an underlying bias there, or an underlined element that we need to consider, but that's generally where researchers will opt for. So those are the 6 that have got to do with the non-probability options. And so based on whether you're quantitative or qualitative, based on whether you are either one or mixed, there's a decision that you need to make to choose a sampling method that fits with your particular study. So as I've mentioned, I'm going to reach out to each of you this evening. I'll start with the email addresses of the participants who are online this evening. And I'm going to reach out to you, share the planner, and then ask you, based on our discussion this evening, which sampling method do you lean towards and why? Your sampling method must be influenced by 3 things. Number 1, what is the aim of your study? Number 2, what is the research questions you want to answer? And number 3, is your study qualitative or quantitative? Because it will lean towards probability or non-probability. For the qualitative study, is it possible that you choose the wrong sampling method? Or is it for us as a researcher, as long as we justify? So Noel, what I would say is, as long as you justify and substantiate and back up your reasoning for why you've chosen it, then your research, your supervisor will advise and say, but maybe lean towards this one, or maybe consider this one, or at least that's what I would have done. But my advice from my own research, as long as I justify and I strongly believe in what I've chosen, and I can back it up by why I'm saying it, and it's factual based on the theory that I've learned, then there's no need for someone to question it. Research is subjective. It's how you interpret it and how you can back it up. So my advice would be substantiate it well, then discuss it with your supervisor, and from there, you can make sure everything else is unpacked from this particular step. So the sample will impact how the research methods that you're going to use. Are you going to use interviews? Are you going to use questionnaires? Everything else filters from this particular decision that you make. Can the sampling methods be interconnected? Yes, they can. So you can have one that links to the other, but I would say avoid interconnecting. Rather choose just one simplistic method so that you can write straight to the point. Because if we add too many things, we add fluff, we add confusion, and then it's difficult for the marker to articulate what you wanted to say. So my advice would be precision. Choose simplistically one direction for this particular level, and then later on, when you branch out and you perhaps do PhDs and masters or progress onwards, you can make it more complex because now you understand it a bit better. But for the start, I would say use one and unpack it from there. Could you please provide another example for convenience sampling? Nosipo, may I ask that you put your title on the chat for me, and I can give you an example based on your study. In our research proposal, should we also explain the concepts and explanation, unit of analysis, population, or identify and motivate the sampling method and the technique? Purpose of sample non-probability, yes. So unit of analysis will always be part of you'll always unpack. So this is my population. This is how I got to narrow it down to this particular sample. And this is my reasoning for choosing this particular sample because the sampling method is what. So it narrows down and becomes one conclusive conversation. When discussing sampling size, the textbook says we need denoted by the lowercase letter n. Is this only applicable to quantitative? Yes. So generally, it's used in quantitative to indicate the number for the sample. For us, for qualitative study, we'll just write it out in words, or depending on how you write or how you'd like to denote it. But for that letter n is particularly for quantitative study. So it's advising you how to indicate your number for your sample in quantitative study. I just want to go up and see if I've missed anyone. Okay, I think I've answered everything. If I've missed anything, please may you unmute, and I'm going to conclude with Nosipo's response. The challenges students face during the transition between high school and higher education. This is a similar study to what I've done, Nosipo, so I'd like to share with you studies from my side. Very cool to look at that transition from high school to higher education. There's a number of challenges that students face, especially with the current technology that we're facing, and also especially after COVID, the challenges or the different dynamic that we have. So the convenience sampling is not one that would be applicable for your study because you are clear on who you want. The challenges students face when they transition between high school and higher education, in my mind, the interpretation is clear. It's going to be a first-year student that transitions from school to higher education, or a student who's been at school level or maybe at a gap. It depends on how detailed you want your study or your topic to look at. But in my mind, if your study is qualitative, you already have a clear idea who you are looking for. Your topic or your sampling method would move towards purpose of sampling because you already know who you want, unless you are unclear of who the student is that is transitioning from first year to higher education. But if you could email me, then we could also unpack that conversation a bit more. But from what I see and from my own experience, purpose of sampling would be your best bet. Okay, I think that then covers this evening's conversation, and I hope that there was at least something that you learned and very little confusion, I hope. If there is still confusion, it means there's a bit of reading that needs to be done and a bit of clarity that you still need individually for your particular study. And then I'm going to email you, you're going to reply back, hopefully before next week's session, so you'll have a week to communicate with me, just so that I can pick up from what I need to clarify in our next session regarding sampling before we move on to the next element that Anel listed for us earlier on. Okay, so that's the end of the session. I don't want to keep you too much from your families and from preparation for work tomorrow. So I'm going to conclude here and send you